This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Barbershops have reopened here, so at this point, I don't have any excuse for this. Here's what you need to know right now. Democrats in Congress rolled out legislation today aimed at making it easier to identify and punish police misconduct. Among other things, the bill will curb legal protections for police accused of misconduct and will further limit the situations in which police can legally use deadly force.
Never again should the world be subjected to witnessing what we saw on the streets in Minneapolis, the slow murder of an individual by a uniformed police officer.
The bill is expected to pass the Democrat-controlled House, but the Republicans in the Senate and, of course, the president would still have to sign off too.
I just stood with a total of 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, and we committed to dismantling policing as we know it in the city of Minneapolis.
The Minneapolis City Council is taking the drastic step of defunding its police department and basically starting from scratch in its law enforcement strategy for the city. To be clear, this doesn't mean the end of police on Minneapolis streets right away, but it will at least mean a total reorganization of their police department, and it will redirect funding to other social services that contribute to public safety. The council has a veto-proof majority on this, which means, yeah, they can basically do this on their own. And the country is basically just holding its breath, waiting to see whether coronavirus rates will continue falling or jump back up as more businesses open and as we wrap up a week of large public protests. Not like it's known for risky behavior or anything, but Las Vegas, for one, looks basically normal right now. Public health experts say the next 2 weeks of infection rate data will tell us whether states should go further in reopening, hit pause, or just take a step back. Gen Z, the generation of people who first showed up in the mid-90s, have been the subject of some backhanded compliments recently. Statements like, Gen Z ain't afraid of nothing except asking someone to prom. Or, Gen Z will dismantle racism but won't say anything when a waiter gets their order wrong. Basically, Gen Z kids might be kind of awkward, but they are a generation of young people who are familiar with dissent on a systemic level. I saw personally how young people led marches and demonstrations all over DC this weekend, much like they have for other moments over the last few years. So in this next piece, I leave this empty newsroom to see how a group of young, concerned citizens have used their history of activism to call for racial justice in these recent protests.
These killer cops have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! These killer cops have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! These killer cops...
George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, albeit tragic, were instances that I think really resonated with young people, especially because we've seen so many high-profile instances in our young lives, right?
No peace! No peace!
I feel like oftentimes in the political arena that is an underutilized energy that can have a seismic impact.
Right now we're with a group of demonstrators and you hear what they're calling for. No justice, no peace, Black Lives Matter, justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. This started with a handful of people just earlier this week. And now there are a whole bunch of folks marching down 14th Street, led by Generation Z.
They march for their lives, they march for Me Too, they march for the climate, and now the generation that's been thrown from one crisis to the next through their high school and college years are marching to say Black Lives Matter, and many of them are at the forefront of the movement. That might not be surprising considering that compared to every other generation in America, Generation Z has followed the protests more closely and is more critical of how both police and the president have handled the demonstrations. Some of DC's protests have been organized by a newly formed group called Concerned Citizens, led by a handful of young black men and women in their teens and early 20s.
How's it going? I'm Christian, man. Nice to meet you, very nice to meet you, man. Yeah, it's good to be here. You guys got a turnout here. It's hot as hell, but... Was it like a part of the name? It's like it seems like a broad sort of umbrella. Do you feel like that allows for more people to come in and feel like included in this movement?
Oh yeah, bro, that's the whole idea, bro. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the whole reason why we even did this, because anybody can kind of feel that and be like, oh, I'm a concerned citizen too. Like, you know what I'm saying? That kind of brings in like white allies and all of the types of non-black allies as well. But we wanted to do something whereby as many like young people, different people of different cultures and races kind of come together.
Whose house? Our house. Whose house? Our house. Whose house? Our house. Whose street? Our street. Whose street? Our street. Say, I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like.
So if everyone could take a knee, we know it's hot out. We are going to read the names of our fallen brothers and sisters who have fallen at the hands of police violence. Tatiana Jefferson.
Tatiana Jefferson.
Audrey Marshall.
Audrey Marshall.
Michael Brown.
Michael Brown.
Breonna Taylor.
Breonna Taylor.
Eric Garner.
Eric Garner.
George Mann.
George Mann.
George Floyd.
George Floyd.
Marion Carey.
Marion Carey.
Marie Fair.
Marie Fair.
The Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How do we enjoy that in a world where that list was so long that was just read? All lives matter, but they will not matter until Black Lives Matter.
We can't wait. We can't wait.
Let's go.
We can't wait. We can't wait. We can't wait. We can't wait. We can't wait.
It's easy to overlook the organization that goes into protests these days. A wide range of groups get the word out, work with city government, help manage staging areas that provide food and water to protesters, and make a clear list of demands, which for concerned citizens includes charges for the officers in Breonna Taylor's death, an end to the police practice of chokeholds, and a list of other items. And of course, a big part of getting that message out to the world is social media. For this group, mainly Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Arab Spring happen through social media, right? And so what we realized is in real time, we have the power to affect revolutionary change through these things that we use so trivially on any given day.
It's just a matter of, creating a fire, letting people know where you want to meet, and being clear and intentional about the messaging you're putting out there, and people will show up, especially now. We saw a lot of passion right now, but not a lot of direction necessarily.
We have a lot of energy here, right? It's time to take this energy and it's time to translate it to more than just some sexy moment that is trending right now, right?
Right.
It is time to do more.
This is no longer going to happen because we are going to demand change. We should not have to do this day in and day out. We are going to demand change. And we are not going to stop this time. We are going to keep going until we get justice for all Black and brown lives.
Here's a hint at what's coming next. It's a 3-word phrase that got the mayor of Minneapolis booed out of a demonstration.
This is Newsy.
Moving beyond nonpartisan, Newsy is anti-partisan.
Because we're tired of pundits, of everyone else's opinion.
Be informed, not influenced.
Native women have told me that what you do when you raise a daughter is you prepare her for what to do when she's raised, not if, but when.
Why are we different than every other person? Why don't we have the justice everybody else does?
After George Floyd's death, demonstrators were persistent with their calls to arrest and charge the officers involved in his death. That has happened. But people marching for racial justice have other demands that are fueling this protest movement, some of them related to policing in America. Here are just a few of those demands. Police departments across the country benefit from a program known as the 1033 program, under the Defense Authorization Act, which allows local law enforcement to get their hands on excess military equipment. Some departments say that equipment keeps them safer, while detractors say it can lead to increased police violence. Groups are calling for the end of that transfer of equipment from military stockholders to local police departments. One of the major sticking points when it comes to cases like the one involving Breonna Taylor is that there's no body camera footage from police for anyone to dissect to really see what led to her death. Across the country, people are demanding more accountability from police, which include things like requiring the use of body cameras and ending qualified immunity, a doctrine that can shield officers and government officials from lawsuits involving misconduct. And lastly, there's defunding the police. That's the three-letter phrase that got Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey a chorus of boos at a rally over the weekend. Newsy's Shira Tarlow explains what that means and why it's become a pretty widespread demand during Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Defund the police. They need to cut the budget by $1 billion.
Calls to defund the police have become a rallying cry for protesters calling out police brutality and racial disparities in policing. But there are plenty of questions about what that means. Some activists are pushing for police funding to be redirected to Black communities for services like education, healthcare, and housing. Others want to completely abolish local police forces.
When we talk about defunding the police, what we're saying is invest in the resources that our communities need. Increased funding for housing. We need increased funding for education. We need increased funding for the quality of life of communities who are over-policed and over-surveilled.
Demands to defund police departments have grown increasingly loud among activists in the months after the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, though the idea seemed too radical to government officials at the time. Now it's gaining some traction nationwide with the recent deaths of George Floyd, David McAtee, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police and days of protests demanding change. In Minneapolis, officials recently announced they intend to dismantle the city's police force.
I just stood with a total of 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, and we committed to dismantling policing as we know it in the city of Minneapolis and to rebuild with our community a new model of public safety that actually keeps our community safe.
The city council members who've signed on to the idea represent a veto-proof majority, but the city's mayor is not on the same page. Over the weekend, a sea of protesters yelling shame drove Mayor Jacob Frey out of a rally after he would not commit to defunding the city's police department.
Yes or no, will you commit to defunding Minneapolis Police Department?
I do not support the full abolition.
And the mayor is not alone. The head of the Congressional Black Caucus said she also opposes disbanding police departments, but wants to instead move funds toward community programs.
I think that part of the movement around defunding is really about how we spend resources in our country. And I think far more resources need to be spent in communities to address a number of problems. Now, I don't believe that you should disband police departments, but I do think that in cities, in states, we need to look at how we are spending the resources and invest more in our communities.
Other Democrats support the concept. In New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio said he will shift some money from the NYPD toward youth and social programs.
We will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services.
In Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti is significantly cutting police funding. And in Washington, D.C., protesters painted Defund the Police outside the White House. The presence of law enforcement was significantly reduced in cities across the country in recent days, and the protests were largely peaceful. Some activists say that underscores their belief that more cops does not equal less crime. The movement has caught the attention of President Donald Trump, who tweeted that he opposes slashing police budgets. Some of his top law enforcement officials have also criticized the idea.
It's an absurd assertion, and I don't understand it.
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist. I understand the distrust, however, of the African American community given the history in this country.
Shira Tarlow, Newsy, Washington.
Go ahead and try to guess who said this over the weekend. Black Lives Matter, and so do Black voices. We have a long way to go in the fight against racism for systemic change. If you guessed Gushers, the high fructose corn syrup fruit snack that explodes in your mouth, you're correct. More about how fruit snacks are ending white supremacy after the break.
When you see a ghost forest for the first time, you're struck by how eerie it is. We've got dead trees that mark where the land was 10, 20, 50 years ago. They're the most striking indicator that I know of climate change anywhere on the East Coast.
Like what you're seeing here on Newsy? Just remember, you can come back every evening for a full update on the day's top stories to get caught up on the news that matters most to you. All facts, no opinion. On your schedule, anytime you need us, every day. We're Newsy. Be informed, not influenced.
A lot of brands have leaned into this recent protest movement by displaying messages supporting causes that prompted demonstrators to hit the streets. Casey Mendoza takes a look at whether those sometimes templatized messages are actually resonating with consumers.
Protesters for the Black Lives Matter movement are calling for more than policy. They're calling on companies and big-name brands to recognize racial injustice with more than words.
And I think brands are starting to see, like, hey, maybe we aren't doing this thing right.
Newsy looked at over 300 official social media pages for companies like Disney, General Mills, and Unilever. More than 70% of the brands made a statement calling for racial equality, and roughly half of those statements mentioned specific actions.
It really felt as if it was a copy and paste thing.
And it's kind of like, I've read that, and pretty soon the message gets diluted.
Other crowdsourced efforts found that very few corporate statements mentioned police brutality or the Black Lives Matter movement.
I won't call out anyone specifically, but they would have an image, a social media image with a great quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Fantastic. But they just had to take the extra step and put their glossy logo in the bottom right.
Before the most recent calls for racial equality, brands have been taking a stand on social issues like LGBTQ rights and women's equality for years. While those earlier statements weren't without risk, the rise of brand support for racial justice is potentially trickier, though important for younger consumers.
The strategy of brands is going through a major change right now. The strategy of staying in the middle, right, and not taking a side worked very, very well for decades, right? I'm not saying it did. It worked it built a lot of brands up, a lot of businesses up, specifically for baby boomers and Gen X. Millennials and upcoming Gen Z, you can't communicate the same way.
Research backs up that shift. In a 2018 poll from Sprout Social, 2/3 of surveyed consumers said it's important for brands to take public stands on social and political issues. Around 40% of respondents also said brands were more effective when they followed up statements with actions, such as donations to specific causes. With that in mind, what brand statements are actually resonating?
There are lots of people who have gotten it right. Nike, they've gotten it right. I don't know if you saw Ben & Jerry's statement, they got it right.
Ben & Jerry's was very specific. They weren't asking for unity. They were asking for very specific things.
Ben & Jerry's statement to dismantle white supremacy went viral online, and experts say it's because the company addressed the history of racial injustice and then specifically called out lawmakers to pass legislation aimed at ending racial violence and increasing police accountability. As the protests continue, publicist Stephanie Cottle says she's keeping a close eye on the brands choosing to stay silent.
Saying nothing is really, really telling right now. And what it does say to me, you know, as a woman, as a Black woman, it's saying that you don't care about Black lives, but you care about Black dollars. And that's really scary to me.
Casey Mendoza, Newsy, Chicago.
Up next, turns out cutting down rainforests are bad for even more reasons than we already knew.
The number of African migrants arriving at Mexico's southern border has soared. Immigration officials tag African migrants entering Mexico as apatrida, or stateless.
Sure. Memes and cat videos are fun, but actual news might be a bit more useful. Follow Newsy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get straightforward, opinion-free news right on your social news feed.
So if I've learned one thing from kids' movies in the 90s, it's that cutting down rainforests is typically a bad idea. But what I didn't know is that deforestation is also a big factor in outbreaks of viruses, including likely coronavirus. Ellen Rolfes has this story from Newsy's virology series.
All over the world, trees are disappearing on a massive scale. And it's a phenomenon that's linked to many outbreaks of infectious disease. In Brazil, for example, the burning of rainforest directly impacted the spread of malaria. Clearing land for agriculture in Indonesia triggered the first outbreaks of Nipah virus in humans. And in West Africa, road construction and logging were factors in the reemergence of Ebola. As humans radically reshape landscapes across the world, viruses previously confined to wildlife have more opportunity to spill over into humans, which experts say was the likely starting point of coronavirus. About 60% of all diseases that infect humans originate in animals. In the case of COVID-19, scientists theorized that it originated in a bat and jumped to another species before reaching humans. And while disease spillover is rare, the likelihood of transmission seems to increase when viruses spread first to domestic animals, like poultry, cows, or pigs. And changes to the environment by humans can amplify the spillover effect.
We did an analysis of all the instances of new emerging diseases over the last 80 years and looked at the exact reasons and circumstances as to how those diseases emerged.
Jonathan Epstein is a veterinarian and disease ecologist at EcoHealth Alliance, who studies emerging zoonotic viruses.
One of the most significant drivers responsible for about 30% of all the emerging disease events is land use change. That could be deforestation, it could be agricultural expansion, but it could also be reforestation.
These kinds of shifts in land use are seen all over the world. In disrupting intact ecosystems, they reduce the natural barriers between virus host animals and humans. When EcoHealth Alliance mapped out where zoonotic outbreaks are most likely to occur, the global hotspots, highlighted in yellow, aligned with areas where large numbers of humans and livestock are living near pristine environments that are experiencing rapid development.
Well, when we look at the areas on the planet that tend to be the most vulnerable to emerging viruses, and specifically zoonotic viruses, it does have a lot to do with biodiversity. But it's not the presence of biodiversity that's the risk. It's the change to that environment, the incursion of people and domestic animals that really creates the risk of these viruses getting out of their native hosts and into people.
And nobody can predict exactly when or where the next outbreak will occur, or even what virus will be responsible. But identifying places most at risk is one step that can help researchers earlier detect zoonotic diseases in wildlife and livestock before they have a chance to spread widely among humans, controlling the severity of an outbreak and stopping the next pandemic before it starts.
That's our show for tonight. Remember, you can hit me up on Twitter using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop to let me know how you're digging the show, or if you have ideas where I can get more shirts that look exactly like this one. But don't go anywhere just yet. More top stories are coming your way right now.